Hi, my talk today is going to be about an idea about how a process called distillation might be used in the brain. I'm going to focus on the issue of how the brain stores knowledge about shape, and I'll consider three theories. The first theory is that we just learn a separate appearance model for all possible viewpoints. This is clearly ridiculous. The second theory is the same as the first theory, but that we share weights for different translations. In other words, we build in the ability to deal with translations, but we still force it to learn the ability to deal with rotations and scalings. The third theory, which is the one I'll mainly talk about, is that we store knowledge in the weights about the viewpoint-independent relationships between wholes and parts. We make the neural activities be viewpoint equivariant. That is, as the viewpoint changes, the activities change. But the knowledge is viewpoint invariant. This is inspired by what computer graphics did until it got taken over by deep learning very recently. So one question is, if the knowledge of whole-part relationships is in the weights, how do we access it? What I believe is that we convert viewpoint-independent knowledge into viewpoint-dependent neural activities by choosing a viewpoint and forming a mental image. So if I ask you, is the distance between the tips of the ears of a German Shepherd bigger or smaller than the distance between its eyes? You'll form a mental image of the head of a German Shepherd, and then you'll read the comparative differences off from that mental image. Forming a mental image doesn't necessarily mean creating a bunch of pixels. It means adopting a viewpoint and expressing the information about the wholes and the parts in terms of that viewpoint. And you can see that you adopted a viewpoint because you definitely didn't imagine the German Shepherd huge so it filled most of your visual field, or tiny so you could only just see it, and you didn't imagine it rotated 45 degrees. All those things you know, so you did choose a viewpoint in order to solve this problem. First, what is a spatial relationship? Well, mathematically, it's the coordinate transformation that maps points relative to one rectangular coordinate frame into points relative to another rectangular coordinate frame. This may seem very abstract and mathematical, but I believe people actually do impose rectangular coordinate frames on wholes and parts in order to represent shape, and I'm going to try and convince you of that. Here's some psychological evidence from Irvin Rock. If you look at the country on the left, you're not sure what country it is, but if I now tell you it's tilted 45 degrees to the left, you immediately see that it's Africa. Until then, you probably thought it was some kind of reflective version of something like Australia. So the frame of reference you impose determines what shape you perceive. That's also true of the shape on the right. You see it as either an upright diamond or a tilted square, and you're aware of very different things depending on which way you see it. If you see it as a tilted square, you're exquisitely sensitive to whether the edges line up with your rectangular coordinate frame. If you see it as an upright diamond, the edges don't line up, and you're completely unaware of whether the angles are right angles or not. It's not right angles we care about, it's alignment with a rectangular coordinate frame. Here's more evidence. If you take these two shapes, they're identical, but I'm showing you them from different viewpoints, you can assemble them to make a tetrahedron. But if you ask MIT professors to do this, it takes them more than a minute to assemble these two pieces into a tetrahedron. Now it's a two-piece jigsaw puzzle, and you have to put together faces the same shape, so how hard could it be? We need some explanation of why this is so extremely hard. And in fact, the longer an MIT professor's been a professor at MIT, the more minutes it takes them to solve the problem. So what's happening here is that if you look at the piece on the right, there's a natural coordinate system where two of the axes line up with the tabletop, and the third axis lines up with gravity. That coordinate system is completely unrelated to the rectangular coordinate system we normally use for perceiving a tetrahedron. What's more, the natural coordinate systems of these two pieces are not aligned when you put them together to make a tetrahedron. So, because you see them relative to rectangular coordinate systems, you just can't see how these pieces make a tetrahedron. Even though it's trivial, and there's many other ways of solving it, like saying, I'd better put together faces such that the remaining faces are all triangles. Then it's easy to solve. But for some reason, people don't do that. They try and see how it goes into a tetrahedron, and they can't see it. And that's because of rectangular coordinate frames. Now, before I go any further, I should make a disclaimer. This talk is about not the whole of vision. Vision is basically a sampling process. And we intelligently choose where to look next, so we don't have to process the whole image at high resolution. But for each fixation, we reuse the same neural net. This talks about what happens on the first fixation. So here's one version of theory 3, which I call identity-specific capsules. And I worked on this for a number of years with some very good collaborators. And the idea is that you localize knowledge about a specific shape into a specific group of neurons, which I called a capsule. And this group knows in its weights how all the parts are related to the whole. We then recognize shapes by noticing when multiple different parts predict the same pose for the whole. And what I mean by the pose of the whole is the coordinate transform between the retina and the intrinsic frame of the whole or the part. So here's how that works. Let's suppose you've identified something that you think is a mouth, and you've identified something you think is a nose, and inside those ellipses you have neural activities that represent the details of those parts, including their pose, that is, their relationship to the camera. You also have a probability that you think that thing exists. That's what those P's are. Each part can make a prediction both for what the whole might be, the whole that it belongs to, what the identity might be, but also what the pose might be. If you get several parts that agree on the identity, so the arrows go to the same higher level capsule, and they agree on the pose, then you know they're in the right geometric relationship to make the whole. That's called a Hough transform, and that's one theory of shape recognition that I pursued quite hard. And I still believe there's a lot to it. That it's the agreement between the predictions of the poses from different parts that's the real signature of a whole. So a newer variation of theory 3 is to make the capsules not be specific to particular shapes. So I call this universal capsules, and they're going to be ubiquitous. We're going to have copies of them all over the place. We divide the image into many small locations, and at each location we dedicate hardware to representing whatever it is that occupies that location. It's going to be a retinotopic map. But we also have different levels of representation at each location. And so for each level of representation, we're going to have a universal capsule. That is a capsule that can represent whatever it is that is that location, at that level of representation, but just one of them at each location. So this is a picture of what the embeddings at different levels of representation should look like after an iterative, that is a recurrent neural net, has settled down when you present it with a sequence of frames from a static image. There's going to be a lowest level embedding, which will probably be produced by a convolutional neural net. And those embeddings are depicted by the arrows. The arrows are, of course, just 2D vectors, and in fact these are going to be vectors with thousands of dimensions. And then there's this hierarchy of embeddings. At the top, which hasn't yet settled down in this depiction, we'd like the scene to have exactly the same embedding vector everywhere. At the next level down, we'd like all the locations occupied by a particular object, like a face for example, to have the same embedding vector, exactly the same embedding vector. At the level below that, for the parts of the face, we'd like each part to have an identical embedding vector. So maybe those red arrows represent the nose and the green arrows represent a mouth. Below the nose, we might have separate subparts for the bridge of the nose and a nostril, for example. And there'll be different embedding vectors, but the whole of the bridge of the nose will be the same embedding vector, even if it occupies many locations. So what's going on here is we have islands of agreement. And these islands of agreement are going to be what represents the paths of the image, how it's segmented into wholes and parts at multiple levels. You can think of this, if you're a physicist, as a multi-level real-valued Ising model, but it has coordinate transforms between levels, and the spins, instead of being binary, are these real valued vectors, which should help with local minima and getting jammed up. Here finally is a picture of the GLOM architecture for a single location, that is a single column in the previous picture. So at that location, we'll have neurons set aside for multiple levels of representation, level L-1, L and L+1 in this depiction. And it will be a recurrent net that uses the same weights as it settles down at different time slices, although it may have hyperparameters like a temperature that vary with time. But basically the weights are the same. And within a location, you get three kinds of interaction. If we focus on that level L embedding on the right, that's getting input from the level L-1 embedding at that location via a bottom-up neural net that will have a couple of hidden layers. And that bottom-up neural net will take something like a nostril at level L-1 that's occupying this location, and it'll predict the nose that should be occupying this location at the next level up. We'll also get top-down input via a top-down neural net that also has a few hidden layers that'll take the level L+1 representation, which might well be a face at that location, and from the face it will predict the nose. So there's a coordinate transform there between the face and the nose. We also get those green arrows, which for a static image are just doing temporal integration. For dynamic images they'd be more interesting because they'd have to encode some of the dynamics. And there's one other kind of interaction that's not shown in this diagram, because it's an interaction between different locations. This diagram is entirely about interactions within a location. So you've seen the blue and the red and the green interactions. Between locations, we're going to do something like transformers, but much simpler. We're going to allow locations to interact with nearby locations simply by averaging the embeddings. In other words, each location will predict that the embedding of its neighbours should be the same as its location. But these will be attention-weighted averages. That is, if you're similar to another location, you'll make a strong prediction that it should be the same as you. If you're different, you'll only make a very weak prediction that it should be the same as you. So this is a kind of attention that's used in transformers, but the interactions here are much simpler. There's no issues of keys and queries and values. The embedding and the key and the query and the value are all the same thing here. So the way a level L embedding at location X interacts with a level L embedding at location Y is we simply take the scalar product of those two embeddings, so Lx is the level L embedding at location X, and then we exponentiate those scalar products and renormalize, so everything adds to 1. And what that'll do, what the exponentiation will do, is say if there's a good fit, that'll completely dominate a whole bunch of bad fits. Now what that kind of attention-weighted averaging will do is it will cause level L embeddings to form these islands. Essentially, we're creating echo chambers, so that as it settles down, you'll get these groups of embeddings that all agree with each other and get to agree with each other more and more strongly. Echo chambers are a bad thing in politics, but they're exactly what we want for segmenting an image. Now I want to talk about the bottom-up neural net. I don't have time to talk about the top-down neural net. If you want to know more about that, look at my paper on arXiv. So when you're trying to figure out what's going on in an image, you find parts that are potentially ambiguous. You might have found something that might be a mouth, but you're not sure, and something else that might be a nose, but you're not sure. And you'd like them to disambiguate each other. So if they're in the correct spatial relationship, then they confirm each other. One way to do that would be to have direct interactions between these ambiguous parts. That's what I call a transformational random field. And it's transformational because there's a coordinate transform involved in every interaction. So if a nose is looking for a mouth that might support it, what the nose would have to say is, hey, I'm a nose, and I'm looking for a mouth with the following pose. In other words, it would have to take the pose of the nose, that is its relation to the camera, multiply it by the relation between a nose and a mouth, and that will be the kind of mouth it was looking for to confirm itself. And if that kind of mouth exists, the mouth would then need to send back a message which does the inverse coordinate transform to say, well, I'm not quite what you wanted. I have this pose, and so I confirm that there ought to be a nose with this pose a bit like what you wanted, but not exactly the same. That's quite complicated. That's the kind of thing that happens if you use a set transformer to try and do this. But you need order n squared interactions, and each interaction involves coordinate transforms. There's another way to do business, which is to use something called a Hough transform. Instead of allowing the parts to interact directly, you allow each part to make an ambiguous multimodal prediction for the identity and pose of the whole. That is, the identity and pose of the whole object that's occupying the same location. So there's only one thing you're talking about, which is whatever object it is that's occupying this location. Because of that, you don't need any dynamic routing. Now, the whole is going to be present if many of these multimodal predictions agree. And what we want is that the attention-weighted averaging that we're doing will pick out that agreement. To make that work, what we need is that in each local column, the lower level will predict an unnormalized log probability distribution over the space of possible object instances and poses. It's the cross-product space of all those. That's quite a complicated thing to represent. But if we can make a part make that kind of prediction, then simple averaging will find the predictions that agree. It'll pick out the common mode. But we must use attention-weighted averaging, so we don't try and average with things that are very dissimilar. To implement this kind of thing in a neural net, what you need is for each neuron in the embedding vector at the object level to represent a basis function that's a very vague distribution in the unnormalized log probability space of the product of identity and pose, and possibly deformation as well. The activity of the neuron scales this log distribution, and the full embedding vector represents the sum of all those scaled distributions, which is the same as the product of the individual distributions, except that it's unnormalized. The individual distributions can be very vague because they only need to represent one thing, namely the object that's occupying that location. They're never going to have to represent two things at the same time, but they are going to have to represent probability distributions across what that one thing might be. Now, a big problem for this theory, there's lots of other big problems, but a big problem for this theory is that the bottom-up and top-down neural networks need to be the same at every location. Because now we're making the capsules universal, and you want the same universal capsules everywhere. You want them to be ubiquitous. That's fine in a computer. It's great in a computer because you can fetch the weights of one of these networks from memory once and then use it in all these different locations. It's convolutional. But it seems extremely wasteful in a brain. It's wasteful because it looks like you have to learn all these neural networks separately. And one thing we know that convolutional networks build on is that for vision, the distribution of data is roughly isotropic. It's pretty much the same everywhere. You want the same knowledge everywhere. And it seems crazy to learn that same knowledge in the form of these bottom-up and top-down neural networks separately at each location. So the question is, how can we get the effect of weight sharing in a brain? And that's what the second part of the talk is going to be about. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to a technique called distillation that was invented by Rich Caruana. He called it compression, and was reinvented by me about 10 years later. Distillation is a way of extracting the knowledge from one model and putting it into a model with a different structure. It's typically used, and it's quite widely used now, to convert the knowledge in a big model or an ensemble of big models into a smaller model. So for example, if we have a big model that does speech recognition and runs in a data center, we'd like to take the same knowledge and put it in a much smaller model that can run in our cell phone. The same thing for big language models. So that's what distillation is now used for. It's good at that. I'm going to propose a different use for it. But I want to start with the analogy that distillation is based on. If you look at a caterpillar and a butterfly, they look quite different. And that's because the caterpillar is optimized for extracting nutrients from the environment, and the butterfly is optimized for traveling and mating. Now, with machine learning, we typically take the training data and we extract structure from it, and that's our learned model. But it turns out, now that we know more about neural networks, it's easier to extract structure if you have a very big model with many too many parameters, or if you have a big ensemble of models. They make it easy to extract the regularities, but they're very cumbersome. They don't give us a small production model. And so the solution is to do what the insect does, which is metamorphose. Take the larval stage, and from that larval stage build something quite different. And distillation is doing that in machine learning. So the big cumbersome model that you've learned has sucked the structure out of the data, but it's big and clumsy. And we tend to think about models in terms of the architecture of the model and the parameter values. But there's a quite different way to think about a model, which is it's a function from input to output. If I were to give it lots and lots of different input vectors and look at all the different output vectors it gives, that kind of nails down what the function is. So we can forget the architecture and the weights of the big model and just focus on the function. And we can transfer the knowledge on the big model by transferring that function to a small model. And the function can be transferred into a model with a completely different architecture. So if you have a big model, let's suppose the output is a big n-way softmax between n different classes. The targets are usually a single one and a whole lot of zeros. And that means that the labels that you give it, on average, put at most log n bits of constraint on what the function is. You give it an input image, that's got lots of bits in it, but then you tell it the label, and the label only imposes a small amount of constraint on what the function is. But if we have our hands on a big model, and we take the logits, that is the things you put into the softmax, and we divide them by a temperature bigger than 1 to get a soft distribution, the soft distribution that the big model outputs reveals a lot more information about the function it believes in. So at the top here, you have maybe what the hard targets are for an individual image. That's what's in the database. If you look at the output of a big model that's already been trained, it's pretty confident it's a dog, but it just might be a cat. That doesn't provide much information about the function. But if we now soften those outputs by using a high temperature in the softmax, that is, we just divide all the logits by this temperature, then we get a far more uniform distribution, a far softer distribution, and that begins to show all sorts of things that were hidden if we didn't soften the output. So with the unsoftened output, it thought the probability this thing was a cow was 10 to the minus 6, and the probability of a car was 10 to the minus 9, and basically those are both 0. If we soften it, there's now a significant difference between a cow and a car. Now, the image is actually a dog, and you might think that that difference between cow and car is irrelevant, but actually a lot of the knowledge, if not most of the knowledge of the big model, is not in what the right answer is, it's in the relative probabilities of wrong answers. That's why on a multi-class quiz, it's very instructive to ask people to give the second answer, because then you can see not whether they know the right answer, but whether they can judge what's plausible and what isn't. So these softened outputs reveal what I call dark knowledge, because it would all be zeros in the big model, or virtually zeros. And that's what you're going to train the small model on. So now you're training the small model on information that's far more informative. And of course, when you train the small model, you also use a high temperature in its softmax. So if I ask you, what species is this? And give you the following answers, none of which are correct, it's fairly clear that snow leopards are a lot better than tiger, and tiger's a lot better than cow, and cow's a lot better than carrot. So what you notice here is there's a class hierarchy. The first 3 are animals, and they're all much better answers than carrot. And in the soft probabilities output by the big model, you see this class hierarchy. You don't need to put it in by finding some class hierarchy on the web that somebody made up and telling your learning system about it. The learning system will automatically pick up this class hierarchy. It'll be sitting there in the big model, and it'll show up in the plausibility of wrong answers. And you can transfer all that to the small model just by getting it to give the correct probabilities here when you've softened the output. In case you're interested, it's an Egyptian Mao. So here's some examples with MNIST. I've taken some digits from MNIST and taken a big learned model, and I'm showing you the probabilities of the various classes when you soften the output. If you look at the middle row, you'll see the most probable thing is a 2, which is correct. But the second most probable thing is a 0. And what you'll notice is that particular 2 looks quite like a 0. You know it's not a 0, but it's much more like a 0 than any of the other 2s. And so I'm giving you much more information when I tell you that it's a 2 that looks a bit like a 0 than when I just tell you it's a 2. And in fact, I can tell you it's a 2 that looks a bit like a 0 and doesn't look at all like a 5. That's the thing that's least like. And that's what those softened outputs are telling you. And it turns out that neural nets will learn much faster if you give them this much richer output to learn. So here's a little experiment on MNIST, just to show distillation works. I train a vanilla backprop net with 2 layers of 800 hidden units and using a ReLU as a nonlinearity, and it gets 146 test errors. I then train a bigger net with bigger hidden layers and with dropout and with constraints on the weights and with jittering of the input, so all sorts of regularizers, and that gets down to 67 errors. It's about half the error rate. Now what happens if I take the softened output of that big net and train the small net in exactly the way I trained it before? When I'm training the small net, I don't use dropout or weight constraints or jittering. I just use the softened output of the big net to train it. So the claim is it's now got richer data because it's getting to see similarities between things in the desired outputs. And indeed it works. So when I train the small net with these soft targets, it gets 74 errors. It's only slightly worse than the big net. And it gets nearly half the error rate of the little net trained directly on the data. This is because soft targets show the small net how it ought to generalize. That is, they show the small net that, okay, the right answer is a 2, but if you had to guess the second answer, it would be a 0. That's a generalization. And when you're training the little net, you're teaching it to generalize the same way as a big net. So assuming the big net learned a good model, when you train the little net, you're training it with a much better objective function than we normally use. You're not training it to get the right answer. You're training it to generalize the same way as the big net. And we're assuming the big net already generalizes well. So finally, you're training something right. You're training it to generalize, not to fit the training data. Just to show you how powerful this effect is, I trained a big net on all 10 classes of digit. I then transferred the knowledge from the big net into a small net. And when I was doing the transfer, the small net never saw a 3. As far as it was concerned, the 3 was a mythical digit. It had the output category 3, and occasionally, if for example it got a 2 that looked quite like a 3, it was told there's a very small probability that's a 3. And after training like that, never having seen a 3, obviously it believes 3s are very rare. So then we simply raise the bias of the 3, so it doesn't think they're so rare anymore. It thinks they're about as common as other things. And now, if you take that small distilled net, it's very good at 3s. It's almost as good at 3s as it is at other classes. So it's learned what 3s look like simply by being told that this 2 is a bit similar to a 3, and that 7 is a bit similar to a 3, and this 5 is a bit similar to a 3, and that 6 isn't at all like a 3. And that's enough to teach you what a 3 is like. One nice twist on distillation is that instead of first training a big net or a big ensemble of nets and then distilling the knowledge into another net, we can do co-distillation. That is, we can train 10 little nets at the same time. If we train them independently, they get an average of 158 test errors. These are smaller nets than I was using before. And if you ensemble them, you get 143 errors. But the other thing you could do is, as you're training them, you could tell each net to try and agree with the softened answers of the other nets. It's peer group pressure. You're trying to make them output distributions similar to the other nets. Now it turns out you have to start off by letting them learn a bit separately, so they don't become too similar immediately. And then you try and make them agree with the other nets. And what happens is, the individual nets end up much better than they would before. The ensemble isn't much better than the individual nets, but the individual nets are better. They've shared knowledge as they learned. And this will work particularly well if the different nets see different subsets of the data. So that didn't happen in this case, but if you had so much data that you couldn't run it through all the nets, if you run different subsets through different nets and average them, that'll be a way of transferring knowledge about data that the neural net's never seen into the neural net by trying to agree with other neural nets that have seen that data. That's pretty much how a scientific community works. We look at the data directly, but we also read publications and we try and agree with what other scientists believe. So co-distillation suggests how the columns in a model like GLOM can share knowledge between the neural nets. What we're doing when we average an embedding with the embeddings produced by nearby nets is we're creating a better training signal for training the bottom-up neural net. So we'll get at level L, we'll get what I call the consensus embedding. And that's an average of the bottom-up prediction from level L at that location, the top-down prediction from level L plus 1 at that location, the attention-weighted predictions from nearby columns at that level, and you average all those together with appropriate hyperparameters, and you'll get a consensus, what all these sources of information between them think is the best bet. And now you can train the bottom-up neural net and also the top-down neural net to try to agree with that consensus. And of course the consensus contains the opinions of neural nets at nearby locations if those neural nets were looking at the same part or object. So if we're at the object level and there's a nearby location that's part of the same face, it will have an opinion about what the face vector should be like. And if that opinion is similar to our opinion, because it's the same face in a nearby location, it'll provide additional training signal for the bottom-up neural net and the top-down neural net, particularly for the bottom-up neural net that predicts the face from a part of the face. And that training signal is what allows knowledge to be transferred from one column to another. So that I think the whole system is doing co-distillation between lots of local models. That's what's happening in these retinotopic maps. And that's why they're not nearly as statistically inefficient as you might think. Now, actually, this co-distillation has one big advantage over weight sharing. Even if you could do weight sharing, it's very hard to see how to apply it if you've got a non-uniform retina. If the size of the receptor fields gets bigger as you move out from the fovea, and if the photoreceptors aren't uniformly spaced in a nice grid, what you've got is a retina that pre-processes different parts of the optic array differently. And what you want in one of these bottom-up neural nets is not a model that is specific to how that part of the optic array was pre-processed. You want the different neural nets to implement the same function from the optic array to the output. And with co-distillation, they're doing that. Co-distillation can transfer knowledge from one column to another column, even if the columns pre-process their input quite differently. That's something you can't do with weight sharing. So that's all I have to say. The main point of this talk was just to suggest to you that the fact that the brain can't do weight sharing doesn't mean it can't get many of the advantages of a convolutional neural net. Because if it's willing to average opinions from nearby locations and then make its neural nets, its local neural nets, try and agree with those averages, it will be doing co-distillation, and that will transfer knowledge between locations.